Welcome to Wild Connection, the podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jennifer Vertelen. I'm a scientist and author that studies animal behavior. I'm passionate about animals and exploring the complexity of their lives, their intelligence, relationships, families, social connections, and emotions. I also love helping people reconnect with nature to live better lives. This podcast is about you, other animals, and how we're all connected in this wild and crazy thing called life. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Wild Connection, the podcast. For as long as we've studied the natural world, great apes have captivated us and challenged our understanding of what it means to be human. From the early field studies of Jane Goodall, Dian Fossey, and Birute Galdikas, three pioneering women who transformed primatology, to the groundbreaking work of researchers who followed, every new discovery about our closest relatives has reshaped our perceptions of intelligence, culture, and behavior. Among these leading voices is Dr. Richard Wrangham, a primatologist whose research has illuminated the evolutionary forces that shaped both apes and humans. His work on chimpanzee behavior, aggression, and the role of fire in human evolution has sparked new ways of thinking about what truly sets us apart from other species and what connects us. I'm pretty honored that today I get to talk to him. I first met Dr. Wrangham in 2005 when I was a graduate student, never dreaming that I would one day walk in the forest where he started the Kibale Chimpanzee Project in Uganda. We've missed each other in Uganda, but I'm honored to have connected with him here. Hey, everybody, welcome back to Wild Connection, the podcast. I am beyond excited because today I'm getting to talk to, I would say, one of my heroes in primatology and anthropology and all kinds of things behavior-wise with great apes. And that is Dr. Richard Wrangham. Thank you so much for being here.
Great to be here. I'd love to see the Ugandan background. Here I am stuck in Britain.
Yes, and here I am in Windy and in Buhoma, and a place that you also know very well, at least parts of Uganda. And before we kind of talk about your extraordinary research, I mean, you've written tons of books, you've been working on chimpanzee behavior and many other things for a long time. I would love for people to get a sense of how you even came to be, focused on primatology and start your work on chimpanzees. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your background and how that happened?
Okay, well, I've always loved natural history. I grew up in England and wanted to go bird watching and so on. And so when I was leaving high school, I wrote to everybody I could find a name and address of, and I ended up spending 9 months in Zambia in a national park called Kafue National Park, working for a great conservation biologist, John Hanks, and that was before I went to college. And then I went to Oxford University to study zoology, and in my first day at Oxford, I went to the expedition club, and that led to forming an expedition to go to Kenya and work in a forest called the Cherangani Hills forest. And at that time, I was working on antelope. I studied waterbuck in Zambia and then bongo in Kenya. And then we discovered the northernmost distribution of the golden moles in Africa during that expedition and went back to study them. So I was just keen on doing all sorts of different stuff. But when I graduated from my zoology degree, I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And my tutor was a guy called Harold Pusey, and he said, well, my daughter, Anne Pusey, has written to Jane Goodall and asked if she could go and work with her, and she's doing that. Well, I knew Anne because she was in my same zoology class at Oxford. So I was just fantastically lucky. And Jane Goodall at that time wanted to have some people working as research assistants in her study of chimpanzees in Gombe. And she took me on. And I was one of 8 research students who were working for her. And I'd been working with moles, I'd been working with antelope and birds a little bit, and so on. But once you see chimps in the wild, of course, you realize that there's something really very different from them, from any other non-human species. And so within a few minutes of being able to see chimps in the wild, I realized that this was something extraordinarily special. And that was how I got going. I spent a year working with Jane as a research assistant for her, and then that got converted into a PhD. And then later, I started my own study of chimps in Uganda.
Yeah. So okay. So wow. I mean, that's pretty incredible. And as someone who's studied prairie dogs and then lemurs and now gorillas, absolutely. I mean, prairie dogs are fantastic and they're very interesting for certain kinds of questions. But once I saw gorillas in the wild, that was it. There was something different, and it leads to all these other kinds of really interesting questions. Now, how did you choose or decide on doing your research in Uganda and where you ended up? How did that come about?
Well, what happened while I was in Gombe was that we were there, me and these other, my compatriots as research assistants and students. In the early 1970s, we were really the first group of people that were following chimps wherever they went. Because until then, Jane had organized this feeding system where she put up bananas in an area of, about the size of a small garden. And the chimps would come and be attracted by the bananas. And she was able to get just, wonderfully detailed accounts of their behavior and their individual personalities and their gestures and so on, which really made the study in all sorts of ways. But by the late 1960s, she realized that it was a good idea to cut back on the bananas because that was introducing an artificial element to things. And so I was there at a time when we were trying to just follow the chimps wherever they went. And what that led to was the discovery of this tremendous hostility between neighboring communities. So I would do follows of different individuals several days at a time and see them going all the way south and running into the neighboring community there. And then they go all the way north and running into the neighboring community there. And we were starting to detect these very tense interactions where they would run away if they thought that the other group was rather big, and they would go charging forward if they perceived the other group to be rather small, just a few individuals there. And then the killings started. And just after I left, the first killings were recorded where members of our group, as it were recorded really beating up so badly members of neighboring groups that those died. Well, this led to extraordinarily important questions about the evolution of behavior. And so I say all that because in answer to the question of what was I doing going off and starting a new study of my own, a very big question was this killing that was going on all due to natural forces, or was there an influence from the presence of humans, particularly maybe giving the bananas and somehow exacerbating things? And at that time, there were really 4 long-term studies of chimps in the wild. And I thought, okay, we just need more and more studies of long-term studies of chimps in the wild. And now you can point to something like 15. And so I went off and looked for somewhere where I could start my own study and see whether or not the cultural variations that we already knew happened in chimps included, was there a cultural variation in this intense hostility between groups? Would you find a chimp population where they all loved each other? or was this going to turn out to be rather a consistent aspect of chimp behavior? And that was one of many kinds of questions about cultural variation. But of course, it was a very important one. And because of my being exposed to some of the direct evidence for the aggressive behavior of chimps between groups, I became particularly fascinated by that.
Okay, and then you ended up in Uganda and you started your research in Kibale National Forest or National Park. I can't remember which one it's.
It became a national park while I was there. So I started in 87 and it became a national park in 93.
Right. Okay. Well, and I think so. I think a lot of people think, I don't know, it's sort of glamorous, right? To be following chimps in the forest, and many people dream of it. And I know I dreamt of following gorillas in the forest, and now I do. Can you give a sense of what it was like to be just following the chimps wherever they go? What was that like for you? And especially in the days before there might have been a research station or some of the minimal comforts that we can now have, because you started, I believe, in 1987.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so,
I'd been in Gombe from 1970 to 1973.
Yeah.
And the thing about that was that Jane had done all the hard work. And so when I arrived 10 years into Jane's study, the chimps were well habituated. They allowed you to follow them at pretty close quarters. And we were doing some of the first follows of chimps just wherever they went. And so we had this incredible privilege of being able to see them really well, be with the chimps, chimps not minding us and so on. But at the same time, being immediately able to see extraordinary things that were going on. So it was very exciting. Every night we'd meet where we were all having our evening meal with different stories of who was doing what and what their interactions were and some extraordinary behavior that no one had ever seen before. And, it was just a fantastic sense of discovery. Oh, you'd got a red tail right behind you.
Yes, for the listeners, the thumping was a red-tailed monkey landing on a tree behind me.
That's perfect. So I mentioned this, tremendous thrill of being just dropped into a situation where all of the hard work had been done, in a sense, and it was just skimming the cream by being able to see the chimps at close quarters and develop an intense understanding of their relationships, following the daily soap opera. Just terrific. So the reason that I mention this is because starting out a new study, unless you knew that it was going to be as exciting as that, it would be much harder. And particularly because in the new study, we were not using the trick that Jane had used, which was to put out food for the chimps. Instead, we were determined to make sure that there was no such interference. Well, that meant that everything took a long time. It took about 4 years before we were able to see the chimps on the ground. It took 21 years before the chimps were so well habituated that we could follow all of the individuals and develop a protocol for recording behavior that involved individual focal data from dawn till dusk. So it was an incredible satisfaction in 2009 when we really started doing that. And now, we have just amazing data because almost every day we have dawn to dusk follows of particular individuals. But those early days were nothing like that. And in many ways, I just loved those early days even more because it's not particularly scientific, but the thrill of getting to the point where you can recognize different individuals because you can see them close enough, and where you can actually follow them for an hour or two at a time without losing them. this sense that you're slowly breaking through into the society of these fascinating individuals was just tremendous fun, and the sense of building up an ability to be part of that secret world is so satisfying. And lots of people have done it now. I mean, as I say, there's about a dozen or more different long-term field studies of chimps, and so it's great that so many people are doing this. But in your own little private world, with your own little particular community of chimps, it's a huge thrill. Learning about their different personalities, even though what you're seeing is just a variation on a theme that is becoming well documented Africa-wide.
Well, and I'm curious, that made me wonder, are there any individuals, even from those early days, when you were first getting to move with them and have them start to accept your presence, are there any particular individuals that just struck you or stood out for you? I mean, I would hate to say, oh, do you have one favorite individual, right? But were there some individuals that just really, I don't know, caught your attention more, or that you felt somehow a better relationship with, if I may use that word, that have stuck with you over the years?
Yes, certainly. And of course, from the point of view of the science, you don't want to let this intrude. But of course, from a personal point of view, there are some individuals who become those with whom it's really fun to spend a lot of time. And of course, the last thing you want to do is develop a relationship. What we don't want them to pay attention to us at all.
Right.
We want them to disregard us, and it would be a very, very disturbing feature if you started grooming with one individual, and
no,
they groom back.
Yeah, I didn't mean relationship in that sense. I meant just sort of that distant feeling that you just like that particular individual. There's something about that individual that strikes you, and you have, I don't know, in that a remote relationship, not a direct. No, definitely not a direct relationship.
Right.
Yes.
Well, I mean, the first one that really I sort of developed that kind of feeling you're talking about with in Gombe was Jomeo. Jomeo was one of the biggest males, maybe the biggest on average in terms of his weight and his length. And so you might have expected him to be a very high-ranking individual, but he wasn't at all. He was very low-ranking. He had a rather nervous personality. His mother had died when he was in adolescence. He had a younger brother who was much tougher, but Jomeo gave sort of kind of socially subordinate, if that's really relevant between brothers, to Sherry. And I often noticed that Jomeo would end up sitting next to me, and it wasn't particularly me. It wasn't me that was responsible for that. And I think that when I say next to, just 4 or 5 yards away, something like that, would often notice that he was there. And so, of course, it was rather touching from my point of view that this sort of, in some ways, rather lovable personality of a big, powerful male who felt a little bit nervous around other males would want to end up being slightly closer to me than typical males were. Presumably because I offered some kind of protection.
Right.
So that's a case where I thoroughly enjoyed seeing him and feeling that he appreciated me, but at the same time I didn't want that to happen from a scientific point of view. I didn't. So I would occasionally make sure that I actually removed myself. Right. But Jomeo became a sort of a favorite of mine for that kind of reason. And then other chimps were favorites for almost the opposite reason. You admire their initiative and their social creativity. There was a lot of tension when I was there between, on the one hand, two brothers, Figan and Fabian, and on the other hand, someone who was just about the same age as Figan, just a year older, I think, Everett. And so Everett would sometimes get bullied by those two, and I would find myself sharing the perspective of the underdog.
Yes.
And these are individuals that you just spend a lot of time with. My job in my first year was to work with individuals who had siblings and look at their sibling relationships. And this was Jane's request to me, and just to collect data on the siblings. Well, there were only 8 siblings in the community, and so spending a day every, or probably a couple of days, 2 or 3 days a month with each of the siblings meant that you spend a lot of time with them, because you would see them on other days as well, and become really intrigued by what they are thinking about and how they're responding to, in particular, their brother, their sister.
Yeah. Well,
and it's when you're doing that, it becomes very human.
Of course. And a word that you used that I liked was social creativity. And so I think, what does that mean? Like, can you give an example where you saw something that struck you as really innovative or creative, either individually or in a social dynamic that leads to you using that kind of description?
Well, in Kibale, one of the first individuals I got to know well was called Kibale. And the reason I got to know her well was because she was slow, and that was sad because she had lost a hand to a snare. So she had to walk on tripedally. I think probably she was a juvenile when she lost it. That's the typical age. And she was a young mother. So the party of chimps would disappear, and then she would sort of rather limp along as a result. And I think life was just pretty tough for her. She didn't probably feed quite as well as the other individuals because she was slow to arrive in the feeding tree. She would take a relatively poor feeding position. One way or another, it was probably partly due to those difficulties that led her to have a very long interval between births. So it was actually turned out to be 8 years before she got pregnant again, after she gave birth to her first offspring, which was in 1985. And so that was a couple of years before I started, and the birth was documented by my colleague and compatriot, Isibiri Basuta, a Ugandan who was doing a PhD on these same chimps, and with whom I sort of shared the early days of our work there. And I mentioned about Kibale because her son Kakama became very attached to his mum, so attached that he did something I've never seen in the wild with any other chimp, which was that he did something that has been seen in captivity, and in captivity it was called a lip lock. And the lip lock is where the young one sucks on the lower lip of somebody, in this case his mother, and he would do it for a long time, up to 10 minutes at a time, just holding on and sucking, even when he was quite old, 5 or 6 years old, something like that. Well, eventually she did get pregnant again, and during her pregnancy, the following thing happened. I was alone in the forest with Cabaroli and Kakama. Kakama was it's called the prince. He was her one offspring. And they were getting up and moving off at one point after they'd been on the ground. And I got up to follow them. And Kakama looked at me and then moved away, and in a sort of rather playful mood, landed on a log about sort of, I don't know, a foot long or something like that, 6 inches wide. And as he came up from it, he did a somersault, holding it to his belly. And as he then went off, he held the log with him in various different ways. Sometimes he held it to his belly. Sometimes he held it by one end and it bumped along. But he kept it with him. And we walked something like 200 or 300 yards, and he was following his mum. And they got to a feeding tree and climbed up the feeding tree, and the vegetation was a little obscure at that point, and I couldn't see exactly what was happening. But eventually I found a spot where I could see him and Cabaroli, the mum, and they were a few yards apart in the tree. And he had the log next to him on the tree, sort of balancing on the branch where he was sitting. So that was kind of amazing. And then as he moved from feeding spot to feeding spot, he took this little log with him. And then at one point it fell. And it fell, 50, 60 feet or something. It was reasonably high. And I was startled to find that he came down the tree. He went and found the log, and he took it with him and climbed all the way back up the tree and went to a feeding site and sat with the log again. The feeding bout went on for a bit. Now, I remember that Cabaroli, being pregnant, was rather unenergetic. She went off and made a nest to sleep in during the day, just next to this tree. He then went off and made a nest for himself, as sort of typical. The mums do it, the young one does it. And I couldn't see exactly what was going on. I had to move and see what was going on. And I could see then that he was lying on his back in the nest with the log on his feet. And he was playing the aeroplane game. So the aeroplane game was something that the chimps sometimes do, where the mum lies on her back and she's got her baby above her, and humans do it too. I often did it with my kids and so on. You move them about and so on. Well, he was doing that with the log. So that was fine. And then at some point, he stopped that. They're all lying there. He got up and he made a little nest, smaller than I've seen any chimp make any nest. And he took the log and he put it in the nest. And then he went back to lie down.
Wow.
So you ask for a case of social creativity. It was social in the sense that he was clearly treating the log in the same way that a mother treats an offspring.
Yeah.
And the big question I would love to know, and of course, never will know, is did he do this prompted by the thought that his mother was pregnant? And I can believe that chimps, are capable of that sort of thought.
Right.
I can believe that he realized from his mum's behavior and maybe her look that she was pregnant, and that he could be anticipating having a sib.
Yeah.
And a couple of months later, his sister was born, and life went on.
Well, I have a follow-up question, but first I would love to share an interesting story about that idea that they might know that there's a birth coming. So years ago, I volunteered for the Center for Great Apes. I'm pretty sure you know Patty Reagan. I would imagine. Yeah. So that's where I started when I was in undergrad. I was a volunteer when they first began. And at the time, one of the keepers was pregnant, and Grub, at the time he was about 3 years old. He was a chimp, 3 years old. And I remember when the keeper was very, very pregnant, she was, about ready, maybe a month away from giving birth. And she asked Grub, "Where's the baby?" And he put his hand on her belly. And
wow.
So they may even be able to detect it chemically, right? I would imagine sort of hormonal. I don't know how they would know, but she asked him, "Where's the baby?" And he touched her belly. And so so my follow-up question though was, did he ever play with his sister in a similar way that he played with the log?
Yes, it's a great question. I'd love to be able to say I knew the answer, but I never saw that.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Wow.
I mean, maybe, of course, the frustrating thing with chimps, just like all animals, is that you don't see them 100% of the time.
Of course.
You never know what's going on.
For sure.
What happened the rest of that day, he kept the log with him for about 4 hours. Mm-hmm. And they were moving on the ground through thick vegetation. I was crawling along behind them, because the vegetation was so thick, there was any way to get through. And then we heard bush pigs. And the chimps are scared of bush pigs, as they should be. We had one killed by bush pigs not long ago. And they ran and moved off, squeezing through the vegetation as fast as possible, and I disappeared and never saw him with the log again. But there was one occasion later when one of our field assistants, there were two of them there, but one of them reported about him playing with a log again. Right. But that was it. We've never seen any other chimp do it. And it's one of the sort of, the joys and frustrations of working with chimps, that this sort of creative stuff can happen. And you want to be able for it to happen enough to be able to build it up into a convincing sort of generalization.
Sure.
But at the same time, you don't want it because you want to have evidence of this extraordinary creativity.
Well, and so that brings up a really interesting question in terms of just sort of science and how we do science. I've noticed, and I don't know, I've just noticed that there's less emphasis or value placed on those kinds of sort of naturalist kind of observations, right? Where and it's great. We have all this technology now that can do all kinds of complicated things, and we can ask really interesting kind of technical questions. But I sort of long for the days where those observations are really valuable, even though we may not see it 100 times or in every single individual or even in the same individual more than once. But what value do you think those kind of rare observations have to contribute to our understanding of other species, and is there a way to bring back that sort of, I don't know, respect's not the right word, but sort of value for those kinds of things?
Yeah, no, I mean, clearly there are wonderful ways to get a sense of the differences in mental power, call it, among species, and to think about what it means for the evolution of human mentality. And it is difficult to use them, but when you think about the kind of work that Andy Whiten and Dick Byrne did in asking researchers to submit examples of deceptive behavior, and then taught them up across species and and try and take some account of the amount of observation time of the different species, and then you can start figuring out that the species with the bigger brains tend to be recorded as having more examples of this sort of stuff. So you're right that it's in many ways those sort of descriptive accounts have given way to statistical rigor. And that in some ways it is disappointing. But the opportunities are still there, and maybe we haven't taken enough advantage of them recently.
Yeah. Well, and so you brought up something that you've also written a lot about, which is how understanding what's been going on with the chimp communities that you have studied and what that tells you about human evolution. And I want to kind of zero in on something that might be a little surprising for folks, but that I think you've written on, which is about really how cooking transformed human societies, right? And I recall, so I don't know if it was a formal study, but I sort of remember reading about an experiment done, maybe with chimps or captive, where they offered the opportunity for the food to be cooked, but they had to carry the food from the location to the place for it to be cooked. And most of the food never made it to the place to be cooked. It was just eaten along the way. And so I don't know if that was an official study or if I just remember wrong, but do you know anything about that? And then why do you think that cooking created such a big transformation for human societies?
All humans eat cooked food, and when you look at cases of people trying to or succeeding in eating their food raw, you find that we don't process the food anything like as well as chimps do. And this for me goes back to spending all day with chimps, studying their feeding behavior, trying to eat everything that they ate, and then sometimes going out on days when I wasn't carrying any of my own food with me, and seeing if I could survive on eating chimp food, and discovering for myself that it was completely impossible because chimp food is mostly pretty nasty from our point of view. It's far too fibrous. It's incredibly dry. It's often got really foul tastes. So even though they are such close relatives, it's just a totally different world in terms of diet. And I assembled the evidence and certainly convinced myself, and I think most people reading it, that that we have become adapted to eating our food cooked, and that we now cannot survive on eating raw food in the wild. And once you realize that we actually need to have fire in that way, then you start thinking about all the ways in which fire, the control of fire, affects our lives. And one of the big ones is that we all assemble to eat cooked food in the evening. And if you're a nomadic hunter-gatherer, then that is the one time when all the group comes together. And that's the time when social relationships are expressed in extraordinarily important ways, and stories are told about around the campfire, and all the things that make us human are sort of expressed around the campfire in all sorts of ways. Let's see. I'm wondering. What was the question?
Well, so that was it, right? How do you think that cooking transformed human societies? And so you just said that, right? Where everybody came together and comes together. Aside from dietary and sort of how we've evolved to process our food, coming together, that created an opportunity. Because there's never really a time, is there, where every single member of a chimp community is just gathered like in the evening over a campfire? No. And so...
That's right. And they're just, in several populations, including ours, you never see all the individuals together at one time. And so, fire has this tremendous sort of agglomerating characteristic. But you know what I was thinking about with your question? You said, what about these chimps that are sort of encouraged to cook, but actually eat the food before they have the opportunity? But that's not quite what happened in the experiment, very ingeniously developed by Alex Rosati and Felix Warneken, where what they did was to develop this sort of magic arrangement from the point of view of chimps, where if they put a raw piece of food into this particular little set of equipment they had, then then cooked food came out later.
Okay.
They had to have a magic system because they didn't want to have the chimps actually playing with fire.
Okay.
So it was like a conjuring trick the way they did it. And then what they found was that the chimps actually liked the cooked food so much more than the raw food that they would wait for several minutes to have it cooked. The conclusion was that the steps towards cooking, which involves inhibiting the desire to eat the food raw immediately, were not very far away in chimps from ourselves. So that was kind of a rather nice experiment, suggesting that it didn't need a tremendous number of steps for our pre-human ape ancestors, the Australopithecines, to be able to develop some primitive form of cooking.
Okay, so I got the story completely wrong. So I'm very glad that you set me right on that, and I find it interesting that they preferred the cooked food. So that's really fascinating to me. And with the gorillas, oh my gosh, other than the figs, maybe I don't think I could ever eat what they eat. It's just bitter and.
Yeah, most of it is pretty tough to eat, isn't it? And even the figs, I mean, they're not like the agriculturally selected figs that we can eat nowadays. Out of the whatever it is, 700 species is it of figs in the world? I mean, there's many hundreds of species. I think very few of them you'll be able to fill your stomach with.
Yeah, no.
You might be able to eat a few, but. I don't believe you could. I mean, there's no record indicating anyone could survive on fig eating.
No, I doubt it. And they don't look super tasty, although from the gorillas' vocalizations, they definitely enjoy them.
Yes.
When they're enjoying good food, they let you know. And that's another interesting thing that we sort of share, right? Across some species is this sort of vocal enjoyment of food. And so I know you're very busy and I don't want to take up all of your time, but thinking about this sort of similarities and differences, obviously it's a lot easier when we see chimps or we see gorillas or other great apes to feel this sense of kinship because there's so many things that we see are familiar to each other in behavior and sometimes other aspects. And we know genetically there's very small differences, but those differences can also be big. What do you think is for the audience, to get a sense of one of the biggest ways that we're similar and one of the biggest ways that we're really different so that we can appreciate both sides of that coin?
At the moment, I'm thinking a lot about issues of aggression and cooperation and so on. And in terms of our social relationships, if you take the mother-offspring relationship, there's just huge echoes when you look from humans to apes. The long period of infancy and childhood and the tender relationships that mothers have with their young. It's nothing hugely different in apes from monkeys, but the fact that the timing is much more similar in humans and apes than it is in humans and monkeys, it seems very important. And, one example of this is that, one example of the similarity is the play between a mother and an offspring is far richer and far more developed in the great apes than it is in monkeys. And this reflects, I think, the greater social creativity of the apes. than other species in general. Maybe bottlenose dolphins might have something similar there, but I think you would be wanting to restrict yourself to the bigger brain species to be able to see the kinds of spontaneous, rich, varied enjoyment that mothers take in just tickling their babies' tummies and enjoying this sort of silly games where they come up to you and you push them away, and they come up to you and you push them away, and you come up to them and you push them away. So it's a small but I think significant point. The very obvious kind of empathy that a mother and offspring, or a mother shows for her offspring, because that generalizes more widely to society as a whole. It's seen so well in mother-offspring relationships because they have such a relaxed relationship. Not everybody does have a relaxed relationship, and so it's not so obvious the empathy that a male and a female show for each other, because male chimps can be pretty nasty to females, but under the right conditions they will show that empathy. Jane Goodall had wonderful examples of adults being nice to each other when there was that dreadful polio epidemic, and one might bring food to another. So that's the positive side of really seeing the similarities between ourselves and great apes in terms of a richness of emotional life, in terms of positive, sharing, empathetic, almost you can sort of say fun relationships. Way we think of differences, I think the huge difference, and you may think studying gorillas as you are at the moment, that this is not so striking. I think you'd be right. But with chimps, there's this huge difference in the degree of readiness to lose your temper. Humans are, I think, really extraordinary in the degree to which we have tolerant, cooperative, relaxed relationships with everybody in our social world, everybody in our group, and even with complete strangers. And that's just not the way that chimps are. If somebody irritates, it gives cause for some kind of little bit of competition, whether it's status competition or competition over a little bit of food or whatever it is, then chimps are very ready to just lose it and go, one chases another, or one bites another, or just expresses in some real physical way their intolerance. And I say this because in the few studies that are available to actually compare the frequency with which individuals get into physical fights, then it looks as though the kind of range of difference is that chimps have fights between 500 and 1,000 times as often for whatever it is as humans do.
Wow.
So that's just a big difference.
Yeah.
And I think of it in terms of humans being much more like a domesticated animal. It's like the difference between a wolf and a dog.
Right.
Our dogs, trot along beside us, and we rely on them on the whole not to snap and not to growl and not to chase. But of course, even they do, and they've only been domesticated for whatever it is, 6,000 years, or maybe 20,000. Some people think, but it's a few thousand years.
Yeah.
And I think that humans have undergone a process like that relatively recently, since becoming Homo sapiens. But whenever it happened, for whatever reason, there is this big difference between ourselves and them.
Yeah.
And So, that for me is the fascinating contrast, that we're so similar in our fundamental understanding of each other's behavior and our fundamental ability to engage in a really positive, endearing, loving way. Seeing a couple of big old male chimps chasing each other in a friendly, playful way around a little tree, or sometimes they play around an imaginary tree because the tree isn't even there. Laughing at each other's bottoms, catching each other, and then rolling onto their back and laughing away. It's just fantastic. And any individuals can do this under the right circumstances. But at the same time, they don't have our spontaneous sense of commitment to tolerance, and our inhibition of those more competitive agonistic features that chimps do.
Right. Well, and it's interesting, and there's obviously a lot of variation in humans because some are less tolerant than others, or easier to express their aggression.
But none of them are in a chimp way.
No, it's true. And in fact, I don't know who the author was, and so I will apologize publicly for not remembering. And if I can find it, I will refer to it in the closing. But I remember reading, it was like the first few lines of a book that said, if you took 100 chimps and put them on an airplane, it would never work. They'd kill each other. But we can, for the most part, given the number of thousands and thousands of flights that take place every day, barring these sort of, weird situations that have happened in recent years, you could pretty much count on, even if we were irritated, nobody punched anybody, or, we all sort of cooperate on a plane, and we're all, for the most part, complete strangers. And there's this silent agreement somehow that, okay, we just let's all get along for the next, I don't know how many hours, and just tolerate.
Even under conditions of great discomfort and frustration and awkwardness on the plane.
Exactly.
Well, you're right. So that was Sarah Blaffer Hrdy.
Oh, yes, there it is. Yes. Yes.
And I think it's in her book, Mother Nature.
Yes.
On Mother Nature. But the point that I have made about that is that it all depends what kind of aggression you're thinking of, because there are these two types of aggression. There's proactive, deliberate, predatory aggression, premeditated aggression, and then there's reactive, impulsive, defensive aggression. She was talking about the reactive aggression,
yes.
which is indeed very much downregulated in humans compared to chimps, and that's the type I was talking about just now.
Yes.
But the proactive aggression were very much more similar to chimps, because just like we will be prepared to plan an attack on someone we're trying to get something out of, or someone that's really annoyed us, whatever it is,
Yes.
And just as chimps will stalk and beat up on individuals that they have some kind of tremendous resentment towards, or for some reason they want to do that, so will we. So coming back to your aeroplane metaphor, we have to spend all this time going through security. Why? Yeah. To stop the people who are going to do proactive aggression and bring a bomb on board.
Right. Well, right. And so that's really interesting, because I immediately thought about sort of retaliation and planning, strategizing your aggression versus, well, and then there's this other sort of aggression, which is redirected, I think. Would that count as another type of aggression where I can't directly attack you, you're superior to me, so we sort of use the phrase shit rolls downhill, right? So I'm going to attack the next one who didn't even do anything, but I need to displace my displaced aggression, I guess. I need to displace it onto someone else, or I do displace it onto someone else. I think we do that as humans, and do chimps do that?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, you can get a sort of chain of aggression like that. And this we do it. It's a form of reactive aggression, as you say.
Okay.
But chimps do it a lot more than we do.
Yeah. Wow. Well,
and what's so striking with us? I mean, when somebody loses their temper and gets into a fight, it's news.
right.
It goes rocketing around the social community. Did you hear about what happened? Well, I mean, if chimps did that, they'd be spending all their time talking about it, because it's going on so much. But it's not news for chimps in anything like the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
and you can tell that. I mean, you see this in the humans coming back every day from their time with the chimps. It's interesting. Oh yeah, Big Brown beat up Utamba today. Oh God, what a bastard. But it's not. Oh my goodness, what a shock.
Right. That's funny. Well, I'm going to close with one last question because I'm just so grateful for you and your time and all the work that you've done. And you've also written many books, and I will be sure to put all those links on the show notes so people can find out, where they can get copies of your books. You're an outstanding writer. I can only hope to, become as good of a writer as you have been, and maybe are continuing. So that's my closing question: is, you might be retired, but I don't know if you're like me. Those questions never stop. Those interests don't really stop. What are you kind of working on now, and where are you in things that you're still interested in learning about?
Well, I am retired, but it's true that I can't stop being fascinated by these sorts of questions. And so I'm carrying on doing chimp field work. I mean, I've sort of passed on the responsibility for running the Kaniwara field station to a wonderful group of Melissa and Marie Thompson, Martin Muller, and Zareen Machanda, who are fantastic researchers. But I'll be out in Kibale next month, and I'm interested in a fascinating new behavior where it turns out, it's newly discovered, that the chimps are getting sour juices out of certain leaves, and we don't know why they're doing it. And probably it may take longer than I had the opportunity to find out, but documenting it anyway. But at the same time, I'm also writing about these big questions of what chimps can tell us about human evolution and human society. And the topic that's fascinating me at the moment is to think about the fact that chimps have dominance hierarchies in which, in the case of chimps, the dominant individual is a male. So you have an alpha male. And this is typical of the great majority of animals, that there is an alpha male. In humans, we don't have that. We don't have a single alpha male because even though you might look at a ghastly president who throws his weight around as being the equivalent of alpha male, there is a difference. And the difference is that our human leaders are always subject to their own allies, their own coalition, their own alliance, who can get rid of him if they have the determination to do so. And they can only conduct their leadership business as a result of being supported by their barons, their allies. And I think that this difference has had a huge impact on shaping human society in a different way from chimps. In some ways positive, and in some ways negative, like everything.
Sure.
I'm very glad we're not led by an alpha male chimpanzee who feels free to just individually beat up anybody they meet, which is what they do. But at the same time, I'm rather sorry that we're led by alliances that are capable of organizing capital punishment and all the sort of coercive threats that goes along with that. So, it's another of these questions that comes from realizing that we have these major differences from our great apes, but at the same time, major similarities.
Wow. Well, I will look forward to that book. And I want to thank you so much for your time and for all of your research and for being willing to spend time on the podcast and sharing so much of yourself and your work and the work of others with me and with the audience.
Well, Jennifer, I want to thank you for being a person who is carrying on doing field work. Is so great. It's increasingly hard to find students who really want to do field work because they all want to do these quick experiments and take advantage of all the modern technology and the hard work of going out and the physical labor of going up and down mountains and spending time with the apes is still hugely rewarding, but it's not that many people who are doing it. So it's wonderful that you're doing it. And I really thank you for inviting me to come on, interfering with your time, spending time with the gorillas, because it's much more important to do that, really.
Well, okay, but thank you for that and for the wonderful conversation. That was such a great interview and only about half of what we talked about. The study of great apes isn't just about understanding our past. It's about protecting their future. As someone who is currently studying mountain gorillas in Bundi Impenetrable Forest, I feel this in my heart. And from chimpanzees to orangutans and mountain gorillas, our closest relatives face threats from habitat destruction, poaching, disease, and climate change. But conservation efforts have champions, and one of them, aside from me and Dr. Wrangham, is Ian Redman. Redman began his career alongside Dian Fossey, studying and protecting mountain gorillas in the forests of Rwanda. Over the decades, he's become a global advocate, not just for great apes, but for wildlife conservation as a whole. In the next episode, I get to talk to him and follow the story of mountain gorillas, their fight for survival, and the connections between past and present in the world of primate conservation. This one is also special to me because, of course, I'm proud to be studying the descendants of those gorillas that first captivated us. So join us next time, and thanks for listening.